Good afternoon, everybody. We are back here live on the RAS Picks YouTube channel. We're streaming on Football Better's Twitter. We're kind of all over the place. Simple Handicap podcast feed, Apple or Spotify. Another impromptu reaction live stream to the NFL headlines. Going to continue to do these as often as I can. It's a big couple of days leading into the free agency window next Wednesday. And then, of course, next week is going to be completely out of control. Today's show, I'm going to react to the different headlines that have come up since we last spoke yesterday. I also went through and did a first run of win totals for every team in the NFL. I ran through every regular season game for each team, produced win totals, and I'll get into some of the different methodology I think I've used relative to other places that are going to put win totals, strength of schedule, things like that out in the next coming months. And this will give you a good look at where teams stand before the draft and the free agency window opens up next week. And then I'll kind of reconvene afterwards into May and June after the schedule comes out, adjust everything, and then it'll be a refresher to compare. I think it's good to have kind of a current look at things now and then a look at things at that point later into the summer. And you can get a good gauge on how teams have done, how teams have gone through it, and how teams have gotten better or worse based on how things have looked, as well as their opponents coming up. So I'll get to those in a little bit. I want to remind everybody down in the description, if you're watching on YouTube, footballbetters.com, the free email newsletter is going out at least once a week now through the rest of the offseason. There's additional sends that will happen as well throughout the course. There's nothing planned in stone that's super rigid, but there will be updates going out consistently. So if you want to follow along, more than 17,000 bettors are already on that email list. If you want to be one, you can sign up down below. If you're somebody who signed up last year in the newsletter, that carries over as well, so you don't have to double sign up. But if you'd like to confirm, you can sign up down below, footballbetters.com, or just go straight to the domain in your inbox. Ryan Roberts says, touching all social media platforms with these streams. That's a comment coming from over on Twitter. There's too many platforms to keep up. I'm trying to condense everything together. This is a good way to kind of have everything condensed into one spot. Now it can stream to multiple places. I'd love if StreamYard was able to get an option to stream out to TikTok as well. I know with the resolution or the alignment, that becomes a little bit difficult. And so working on a way to figure that out so it can just be wherever you guys want it to be. But I can just focus on doing one show in one place. The big headache right now, I'll do this on YouTube, then I'll have to go do it on TikTok again, and then it's an upload and edit and post to Apple and Spotify. So one day everything will be condensed into one spot. So let me know if you have comments along the way, what you're looking at, what you're thinking. Happy to answer any of the questions as it happens. Let's get to headline number one. It's the big one. DK Metcalf asks for a trade from Seattle. This is big news because as recent as 10 days ago, we were hearing from John Schneider as well as Mike McDonald how it was an emphasis to keep DK Metcalf as part of the team. And that has now seemingly took a different direction after talks allegedly the last couple of weeks have spoiled. And DK is now asking for a trade, wanting out from Seattle. Few takes on this. The first one that I think makes this quite cloudy and quite uncertain is Dianna Russini came out this morning and said that the asking price from Seattle for Metcalf was a first and a third round pick, which seems awfully rich in 2025. Metcalf, obviously in the prime of his career, 27 years old, looking for that third contract, which is why this is happening now and why this is escalating now as he wants to be secured as the wide receiver market booms. There's been debate on whether or not he's worth the 30-plus mil that is being given out to the top wide receivers in the NFL. I think the answer is probably no for Metcalf specifically, but it's hard not to think about the team and situation that he's been in for the last couple of years and what that might look like in other landing spots with the value that he brings. I think his asking price probably would get more this season than recent years just because the free agency class at wide receiver is weaker than past years. The draft class at wide receiver is weaker than past years as well. And so Metcalf kind of seeking input from the market right now, I think makes a lot of sense from his perspective. But from the side of things for Seattle, I think you really have to go out of your way to find a way to keep him, even if it is extending and giving him that third contract. He right now probably is the most beloved Seahawk in that building at the moment. You can say he's kind of the last piece of this previous regime. I was listening to Hawk Blogger, who I love. Brian does great Seahawks live reaction pods. And he's like, look, quite frankly, right now with Seattle, things aren't great from a fan engagement perspective, and you think from just a political standpoint, what it would mean to keep DK Metcalf, that's significant. There's been kind of back and forth the last couple of seasons about what the relationship between him and Geno Smith is like. There's reports that suggest it's not as strong as Geno has had with other wide receivers. There's arguments that are made that those are kind of false. So what's true and what isn't is kind of unclear on that relationship. But my goodness, when you think about Lockett being let go, which was obviously something that was coming and kind of obvious to see happening, and JSN getting into that number 2 role, you release DK Metcalf and you're building now a roster around just Jackson Smith and Jigba, who's been that slot guy and really emerged last year, getting more usage outside, playing off of a guy like Metcalf. That really changes things if all of a sudden Metcalf is let go and JSN gets put into that pure number 1 role, and defenses can now approach the Seahawks team in a different manner. So I think it's very high priority that Seattle ends up getting things done with Metcalf to keep him. But there's certainly a lot of very interesting landing spots I'll get to when we look at some of the QB wide receiver next team odds that are up on DraftKings. But big news is DK Metcalf asking for a trade from Seattle and a very lofty price coming with it. Ryan Roberts, play from DK camp just to get a 3rd contract from Seattle. My initial thought and take on this was that this is a little bit Stafford-like in a way, where Stafford was effectively testing the market. The Rams let him go out. We allegedly got the offer from the Giants. 1 or 2 teams were interested in him. Raiders were another one, but it was kind of the intention to get the deal done all along. I kind of got the vibe initially seeing that after hearing what both coach and GM said in the last couple of weeks, is that was happening similar. But man, if Seattle loses Metcalf, that's a big loss. So that caught me by surprise yesterday when it came up, for sure, Ryan. Next headline to hit the news yesterday: Maxx Crosby made the highest paid non-QB in the league by Las Vegas. Big news. I think some folks were shocked by the contract, but to me, this was a pretty good reflection of the new staff that has taken over in Las Vegas, between Spytek as GM, Carroll as the new head coach. An interesting note from an interview that I was listening with Spytek, who went on NFL Daily with Greg Rosenthal, was his emphasis of building this team in the offseason is not necessarily to be flashy and throw a lot of money around and have a lot of big acquisitions. He wants to build a team that reflects the values of the team on tape. And he continuously stressed about how he wants to build this culture about when other teams are watching the Raiders on tape, even if they're not as talented as some other teams that are going to come up on the opponent list for teams. He wants there to be an emphasis on effort and playing incredibly hard on offense and defense that shows up. And that was reflected with a lot of what Pete Carroll said at the Combine. And it's kind of created this idea in my mind that the Raiders are going to go out of their way to potentially overdraft a running back coming up in the draft next month. Talk about that as we start to speculate on some draft props and the Raiders sitting at 6. But the Maxx Crosby signing kind of checks that box in a big way. I mean, you watch any highlights or tape or all 22 of Maxx Crosby, he is flying around. He demands extra attention from opposing offensive line. When it comes to be what the culture is being built by Spytek with this new Raiders regime, Crosby certainly fits that bill in a big way. So it makes sense that they go out of their way to pay him. And now you start to think about other pass rushers and what they may warrant in the market, which brings up a quote from TA, which I don't have pulled up, but he made a point this morning that I thought was pretty prudent and astute, where he was saying that salary cap should be viewed as a percentage and not dollar value, as the cap has gone up more than $25 million in the last couple of seasons. And so as these dollar values come through, they come across the wire and you see these deals that continuously reset the market and what you're looking at for the going rate of players, important to look at that as a percentage of the cap comparatively to past deals rather than looking at the dollar value. And if you're always looking at the dollar value, you're always going to get the overreaction to how in the world are these teams paying these guys this much, or how is this guy worth this much? It doesn't make sense. Maxx Crosby would kind of fit into that argument in many ways when you think about the changes and how things have gone up. So I thought that that was a really good point and something to think about, which is bringing us to the next headline, which is Tutu Atwell is signed by the LA Rams, $10 million fully guaranteed. And the immediate reaction from people looking at this was, how in the world are the Rams paying a guy like Tutu Atwell $10 million? That's insane. How is he drawing $10 million? But when you think about the cap increase, that $10 million now is hard to compare to past deals and past deals at the position. When you think about the differences between what guys are worth now and what the cap is now compared to those last couple of seasons. Now, Tutu Atwell may not be deserving of being brought up as a headline on a show, especially one like this, but it was the context that came from this, which I found very interesting. Jordan Rodriguez, who's arguably the best beat reporter for any team in the NFL, covers the LA Rams with pretty immense detail, offered up two kind of interesting things within a tweet. The first was that the Rams are planning to move on from Robinson and move on from Kupp. And this move was made kind of in conjunction with that. Now, I think the Cooper Kupp moving to another team news is not something that's breaking, but a lot of the comments around Robinson, I think, are somewhat new to a lot of folks when you think about the impact that he had last year, how popular he was in prop markets, and, of course, Cooper Kupp being a very popular wide receiver in the league. Rams seemingly moving on from both of those guys. So if you hear news over the next week on both of those guys, what may have been a bit of a surprise when that happens shouldn't necessarily be a surprise now when you're hearing that from her. Another thing that's interesting when you're thinking about Tutu Atwell and maybe just putting a very faint reminder in the back of your mind for 5 months from now when we get to prop betting season for week 1 is she was mentioning how Atwell's role was in a bit of a tough spot last year because the Rams, when they're in 11 personnel, continuously do not sub in those packages. And so Atwell was kind of the odd man out in that, where he was probably justifiably deserving of more playing time on the field. But the way that the Rams operate their offense out of 11 personnel without subbing to put defenses at a bit of a disadvantage, Atwell more often than not found himself on the wrong side of that. And so his lack of usage last year shouldn't necessarily be tied into surprise and shock with this deal, especially if you consider that Kupp and Robinson are moving on. The knowledge, the hands, the speed that he brings to this team should fit in really well. And so it could be a bump in usage for Atwell. I was tweeting with Josh Norris, who was saying he had concerns about a 160-pound wide receiver getting extended playing time for the Rams and holding up over the course of the season. I think that that's a very fair point and a very fair counter to why are the Rams doing this. Lots of commentary from the fantasy community about Whittington getting a lot more playing time and his stock rising in this offense that is now, with the passing game, going to be built around Puka Nacua, which I think is a good indication that the Rams are not concerned about his health going forward with some of these moves that they are making. So some news coming out of the LA Rams, and this signing potentially impacting what the Rams may or may not do in the draft next month. We'll get to some QB wide receiver next team odds, and all of these are available at DraftKings. I'll pull them up on the screen, and we'll kind of go through them one by one and just share some thoughts as we go down the line. Not necessarily anything jumping out from a bet, but I'll highlight some thoughts for those of you who maybe want to take a few flyers on these as you're looking at them. So I've done the video yesterday. I've done some other videos about how much sense I think it makes for Davante Adams' next team to be the LA Chargers. However, what makes sense and what is a good bet are two very different things. The LA Chargers, second favorite to land Davante Adams, plus 450. Green Bay Packers, the current favorite at plus 190. San Francisco, plus 600. Rams, plus 750. Giants, plus 850. Then Broncos, Steelers, Pats, all 10-1. Raiders, Texans, Chiefs, Bills behind them at 18-1. For Adams, again, I think that he is just a slam dunk fit for the LA Chargers. I don't know if they're going to go out of their way to pursue them. They sound more interested in DK Metcalf. There was a good tweet from somebody in the fantasy community whose name is not slipping my mind. I'm not trying to ignore them here on the live stream. They should get the credit that they deserve. But they pulled up, it could have been Ian, actually. They pulled up the wide receiver open rates off the line of scrimmage, and Adams was consistently number one in the early portion of his career. But even in the last two seasons, of all wide receivers in the NFL, Adams 2 years ago was 16th. This past year, he was 15th. He is still a wide receiver that can absolutely get open off the line of scrimmage. His releases off the line of scrimmage are elite. And you think about the Chargers and some of the matchup binds they could put defenses in with a guy like him playing opposite Lad McConkey. I mean, my goodness, the upside there is enormous. Lots of talk about the Packers just because Green Bay allegedly needs to find that number one wide receiver. That's all the talk in the offseason. They need the wide receiver one. I don't know if Davante Adams at this point in his career at this age, as great as he is at getting open off the line of scrimmage, is he that true number one wide receiver? I don't know if that necessarily fits the case. Green Bay obviously shopping for one, and that's why they are current top favorites in the market right now for Davante Adams. San Francisco, another very interesting look if that comes to be the case. DK Metcalf. Next team favorite is Seattle at 3-1. Same thing with the Chargers, 3-1. Pats, Texans, Raiders, Steelers, all between 4-1 and 12-1. Broncos, Giants, Bears, Jaguars, Packers, Cowboys, next up in the list. I was kind of hoping that we would see a bit of a longer price here on Seattle. I think that probably would have warranted a bet. At 3-1 is the current favorite in the market. I could make the case that still seems a little bit long, but probably not good enough to make a bet. I think Seattle's still the favorite to retain him, even though he's asking for the trade. Man, it just seems like a big blunder by this Seahawks team if they're unable to do it. Everything about Seattle, as we talked about in the show yesterday with McDonald, with all these offensive coaches being brought in, is about being physical and running the football. He just makes so much sense in this offense to fit that. I just would be very surprised if they move on from him. But there are the Chargers again as another great fit for a team that is so wide receiver needy. For DK to go to New England, it seems like a stretch to me. He is a guy off the field that loves the nightlife, to put it lightly. You're probably getting a pretty intriguing landing spot for him going to the LA Chargers and everything that nightlife scene would entail. Are you getting the same thing in the Foxborough, Boston area? I don't know. When you think about lifestyle and the fit for him, a place like the LA Chargers makes a lot of sense. Las Vegas certainly fits that bill as well. I'm not saying that's going to be the deciding factor, but for him to decide on where to go, I think New England is going to be a stretch. You're going to play with Drake May in his second year in a very unproven offense. At least teams like the Chargers, the Texans have legitimate top QB options where he can fit in and be a big difference maker. And these teams have the opportunity in the cap space to make that happen. As you go down the list to see some of these other teams, it just seems like less appealing fits for him. Now, the one team that I want to throw out that's way down the board that I think is worth just taking a flyer. I saw on Bet Online, it was at 33-1. We're looking at DK 28-1. The price for DK Metcalf to go to the Kansas City Chiefs, if you want to just put it in the account and take a small flyer at a very big price, I think that is worth it. The Chiefs were in talk with Metcalf last season, and they couldn't get a deal done, and they couldn't entice him to come over. At this long of a price, I mean, we're on March 6th. If this is going to be decided one way or the other, it's going to happen relatively soon. It's not like you're putting in a preseason future and you're waiting for a 7-8 month period for this to be decided. This is going to be sorted out relatively soon. With the Chiefs moving on from Tooney, clearing up cap space, defensive cuts likely to come as well. I can't help but wonder if they're going to push to try maybe land DK Metcalf coming up. There is the Rice suspension that is still pending. We don't know how that is going to be carried out, potentially without Rice for the first month and a half of the season. Do the Kansas City Chiefs try to make a push to land DK Metcalf? I don't think that's a crazy thing to have happen. And at 28-1 here on DraftKings, 33-1 over at Bet Online, potentially available at other books as well. Not a terrible bet to make for March 6th here in the NFL offseason. So one to consider if you're looking to take in a bit of a flyer. Myles Garrett, I really don't have much of an opinion on here. It seems like of all the big stars that are going to be moved but are still in limbo to potentially come back to their team, it seems like coming back to Cleveland has the most turbulence around some of the discussions. It seems like the two sides are very far apart on what has to happen here for Garrett to return to Cleveland. The Browns are the current favorite at plus 150. If you have a stance on other spots he might end up in, you're probably looking at a bit of an inflated number elsewhere that you might be able to find. I just don't have a great take on Myles Garrett. Same thing comes through for Aaron Rodgers. Giants, the favorite at minus 130. There's been a ton of buzz about Rodgers going to the Giants. I'm surprised if that was really true that it hasn't happened yet. I just don't have a good sense on where he is going to end up. Raiders plus 250, Steelers 3-1, Titans plus 450, Vikings plus 850, Colts 12-1. The Colts would not be out of line at 12-1, considering the Matt Ryan experiment, considering the Phillip Rivers experiment. It's not unlike that ownership group and that staff, albeit different now, but not at the GM spot, to bring in a very old veteran quarterback to lead a young offense and drive some competition within the quarterback room. They seem discontent with Anthony Richardson, with all the competition talks that they want to bring up. It doesn't seem crazy that a QB needy team like the Indianapolis Colts could go back to a strategy that they have employed recently to bring in Aaron Rodgers and be that veteran in the room. 12-1 is not a super enticing price. If you see it better elsewhere, let me know in the chat. But if I had to take a flyer on Aaron Rodgers, I would probably do it with the Indianapolis Colts at 12-1. Other next team options: Cooper Kupp, Denver Broncos plus 350 to favorite. Jags plus 550 now that they've released Christian Kirk as the second favorite. Pats plus 650. Chargers 650. Lions plus 650. Cowboys 850. Commanders, Steelers, Giants, Rams, Chiefs, Texans all 12-1 or higher. Lots of buzz about Kupp going to New England. That seems to be the most prominent spot that is being speculated as his landing area. Plus 650 is what that would currently pay. That doesn't excite me a ton. Kansas City as an interesting second option, 12-1. Not super enticing either. I don't know if he's a fit with the Chargers at all. Something that he's had a lot of issues with recently in his career is playing on turf. He really does not like playing on turf. He's referenced a lot and been very outspoken about how it hurts his joints. He's been an advocate for more grass fields. And so you think about some of the issues that has caused him physically playing with the LA Rams. Is he going to stick in the same stadium and play for the Chargers? I don't know if I can see that. And the qualities that you're getting from him, very similar to the qualities that the Chargers have with Ladd McConkey as well. And so to see the Chargers up this high doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Would he go to an indoor team like the Cowboys? Again, that's maybe a negative that could be taken off. Same thing with the Lions as well. And so when it comes to just thinking about what Cooper Kupp might want in a team, I would be very surprised if he moves on and doesn't go to a team that plays outdoors on a natural surface. That's just kind of how I would look at that. But the Les Snead came out yesterday and said that it's very unlikely that he would return to the LA Rams. And so that is why we're seeing their price not even listed and way down the boards. It's kind of the writings on the wall that Kupp is going to be moving on from the LA Rams. And so that's a breakdown of what we're looking at for some of these next team props. I think there's a couple flyers, one or two in there that you could look at. Let's take a sip of coffee and get over to the win totals that I ran. I'm going to hit refresh on this and get it brought up. So I'll explain what I did, and I'm going to take this banner off and clear it up for everybody. So historically, the most common way to do strength of schedule for win totals for season-long outlook in the mainstream media has been look at last year's standings, take the win-loss records of those teams or the winning percentage of those teams, run it against this year's opponents, and then come up with a percentage for that, and that would equate to strength of schedule. Now, it's evolved a little bit with some folks that are more betting space adjacent, and what they have done is taken season-long future prices or win total prices, and they have extrapolated that down where you're looking at all the opponents for the season and you're taking an average win total from those teams, and then you are producing a strength of schedule off of that. What I have done is gone and taken the market and aggregate ratings from last season. I've bunched them up together, And then I've made some very basic and logical adjustments to those end of season market and aggregate ratings. For example, Jacksonville last year finished with a rating in the aggregate that was 6.5 points worse than an average team. They were in that position because Trevor Lawrence was hurt and not playing. That's why their rating was so low. So I've bumped the Jaguars up 4.5 points for Lawrence returning. I've gone through with a number of teams and made those adjustments to produce what I'll call an aggregate set of power ratings based on last year and how teams currently sit. This is something that will be adjusted, obviously, as we go through free agency, players switch teams, as well as the draft, and we'll revisit these later on. But there is a set 1 to 32 of power ratings on how teams rate out relative to an average team. Then what I have done, I'll make this a little bit bigger so everybody can see, is I've gone through and taken every team's opponent for the season, and I have produced, obviously, an opponent rating comparative to the team rating. So, for example, the Philadelphia Eagles will play the Dallas Cowboys at some point during the season. The Philadelphia Eagles in the aggregate ratings are 6.5 points better than an average football team. The Dallas Cowboys are 1.5 points better than an average football team, which makes the difference between these two teams 5 points. I've implied 1.5 points for home field across the league. That's something that'll be debated a little bit with teams that are deserving more so and less than. I'm just trying to keep this as straightforward and simplistic as possible. So I went 1.5 across the board. So for that Eagles home game hosting the Cowboys, home field is worth 1.5, which produces a line of 6.5, which would be relative to a point spread on a big free money line. Eagles get 72% of a win for that game, as it implies to the big free odds that come from that point spread of 6.5. That would produce 0.72 of a win. And then I have taken the sum of all of the games in that matchup to produce a win total of 11.8 for the Philadelphia Eagles. And so all of these win totals are derived from the matchups head-to-head of all the opponents on the schedule based on the aggregate ratings that have produced numbers for all of these games on point spreads tied to the big free money line, and then you get win totals. For the strength of schedule, what I have done is taken an average of all of the opponents' point spread ratings, and I've done that for home and away as well as overall. So when we want to talk about win totals specifically, I think that's a good place to start. And this is not going to be a massive surprise to anybody, so we can go through this relatively quickly. The Buffalo Bills, number one in the NFL, 12.7 wins projected based on their schedule, based on how the teams that they play are power rated, based on their current power rating. No team has a higher win total expectation based on this than the Buffalo Bills in 2025. The Baltimore Ravens are number two at 11.9 wins. And then we have a number of other double-digit teams. The Eagles, 11.8. The Chiefs, 11.3. Then we have the Packers, 10.7. The Lions, 10.5. And then all of the other teams are sub 10 wins. Now, the Packers and Lions have flipped, and this is just coming down to the ratings as well as the schedule. I decreased the Lions rating, even how they finished the regular season with a lot of injuries, just due to losing Ben Johnson. I think that that is an impactful loss for the Lions and what they were able to do on offense. And then that rating obviously went into bumping up the Bears considerably from where they ended last season. And so that is why those two teams may be flipped, which might be different in the minds of everybody listening, whereas the Packers relatively have the same team. There's expectations, obviously, that they're going to add playmakers, which would be a big bump for them. And then those changes would be reflected as we move forward. Now, where this gets quite interesting is starting to look at some of the strength of schedule numbers that this has produced. And so the overall strength of schedule, if we are to sort it, again, you might be looking at this as a bit of an inverse. So, for example, if you're looking at the San Francisco 49ers, who have the biggest negative number next to their name, minus 1.74 for their overall strength of schedule rating, what that represents is the opponents that they are facing on average are 1.74 points worse than an average team. Or in other words, of every team on the 49ers schedule, they would be on average 1.7 point underdogs when priced compared to an average team. And so that is why the negative number on this table that you're viewing on the screen is highlighted as positive for the 49ers, and it's not a bad thing. Now, comparatively on the other side of things, the Detroit Lions have the most difficult schedule of opponents, as their average opponent would be 1.32 points better than an average team on a neutral field in the NFL. So as we go through and we look at some of the outliers and some of the teams that stand out, the San Francisco 49ers, based on this method, have the easiest strength of schedule in 2025. The Saints have the second easiest schedule. The Titans have the third easiest schedule. All of those at least 1.2 points worse than an average team in the NFL. The Pats, 1.03 points worse. And then the Falcons, 1.02 points worse than an average team in the NFL. For the teams that have it very difficult, the Chicago Bears, 1.12 points better. The Detroit Lions, 1.3 better. The Minnesota Vikings, 1.15. And then the Giants, on the very short side of things, 1.12 points better is their average opponent than an average team in the NFL. Now, focusing on just some home and away interesting topics, the Cleveland Browns, the Minnesota Vikings, and the New York Giants, brutal home schedules, the most difficult in the NFL. Browns, 2 points better are their opponents than an average team that they have to face at home. They have things considerably easier on the road, as they're facing nearly an average team on the road. And then the team like the Minnesota Vikings, 2.88 points better than an average team is their average home opponent, while on the road they have things considerably easy as well. Same thing for the Giants, 2.69 points better than an average team, nearly even for their road opponents. So where this becomes pretty interesting, and I start to take away a lot of thoughts, and I'll expand on a lot of these because there's a lot of intricacies that come with this. A team like Minnesota, for example, incredibly strong home field advantage. They're going to be very popular in the futures market as an over team, whether it's McCarthy, whether they end up bringing back Darnold, whether it's somebody else, because the logic is going to be, as you look at their win total, which in this is projected to be 8.5, you're likely to see them in that 8.5 heavily shaded over or 9-win range for their total. But when you think about the Vikings, so much of their big advantage is at home. They have arguably the biggest home field advantage in the NFL, but they're met this season with an incredibly difficult home opponent schedule, which could take away from some of that intrigue in the over on that win total when their big advantage is being met with some of the most difficult competition. Another team that I think really stands out when we look at the Buffalo Bills, very high win total projected, 12.7. My personal favorite team to win the Super Bowl. It's the bit of the inverse for the Buffalo Bills, as their home opponent is just slightly better than an average team. 0.19 points would their average home opponent be favored over a league average team. However, when you look at their away schedule, they have the easiest schedule of away opponents, where their away opponents average 2.75 points worse than an average team in the NFL. So for a team like the Buffalo Bills, very big home field advantage, but the majority of the difficulty that goes into the Bills' schedule, they are going to be able to face at home. When they go on the road, typically you see them priced a little bit differently, but that's where they face the easiest chunk of their schedule, and they face an easier road schedule than any other team in the NFL. So I'm going to go down to the Bills' schedule just to illustrate this and kind of get to my point of why I think this value or this method is a lot more valuable than just looking at kind of the general standings from last year and carrying it over into this year. Look at who the Bills face on the road this season. Atlanta Falcons, that's going to be an indoor game. We know when the Bills go indoors, they're deadly on offense, but it's a Falcons team with a lot of question marks. The Carolina Panthers, another team that's rebuilding, a lot of question marks. The Cleveland Browns, massive question marks. If that's an early season game, certainly an advantage for the Bills in that regard. The Texans, another indoor game and another indoor opponent. The Dolphins and Pats and Jets in the division. And then the Pittsburgh Steelers, another team that's rebuilding. And you start to look at some of these point spreads and how this is going to line up for the Bills. 8, 12, 12, 5, 6, 12, 9, 7, expected to be favored by massive margins on the road. And so a lot of the Buffalo Bills' schedule difficulty is, again, away or at home where they're dominant and where they have a big advantage, and they go on the road. Not only do they get a handful of indoor games, but they're met with a lot of teams that are going through a lot of question marks and a lot of rebuilds coming in this offseason. Another team I want to highlight here is the Chicago Bears. Minus half a point worse than an average team are their opponents at home. But my goodness, you look at what happens to them when they go on the road. 2.6 points better than an average team are their road opponents. The Chicago Bears going to be a very popular team. I already saw a clip from Nick and the guys at You Better You Bet. They had a guest on, and they speculated, if the Bears win total 7.5, what are you going to be doing with that win total? And the guy just snap reacted, I would lean to the over at 7.5. Have them projected based on this for 7.1 wins. Lots of hype around Ben Johnson. Lots of hype around building the offensive line. Lots of hype around the wide receivers and the impact they might have with Caleb Williams and a better offensive system. But look at this Bears schedule when they have to go on the road and what they have to face away from home with a first-time head coach, with an offensive line that's going through transition, with an offense that's going through a building year. They go on the road, Lions, Packers, Vikings in division, all brutal games, obviously with the NFC North being absolutely stacked. But then look at this outside schedule. On the road into Philadelphia to play the Eagles. On the road into Washington to play the Commanders. On the road into Baltimore to play the Ravens. On the road into Cincinnati to play the Bengals. Then on the road into San Francisco to play the 49ers. I mean, this is absolutely brutal. And you look at some of these expected point spreads for the Bears, 6-point dogs, 5-point dogs, 2-point dogs, 7-point dogs, 2-point dogs, 7-point dogs, 3.5, 3. I mean, it is brutal. Could they be favored on the road at the Raiders, especially if it's late in the season? The Raiders are struggling to get things going, absolutely. But just absolutely hellacious schedule for the Bears on the road this season. Another one I want to highlight as well, Detroit Lions, very favorable home schedule, but just like the Bears in division, brutal road schedule. Their average opponent for the Detroit Lions on the road would be 3 points better than an average team in the NFL. And you look at some of these opponents that Detroit is going to face on the road. You thought the Bears were bad. That's the one game that sets up pretty favorably for the Lions right now, as they look like they would be about a 4-point favorite on the road at the Chicago Bears. But then Packers, Vikings in division. Beyond that, Ravens, Bengals, Eagles, all on the road, Commanders on the road, Chiefs on the road, and then a cross-country trip to L.A., the Rams on the road. As difficult as it gets for a road schedule for any team to face, absolutely stacked lineup of opponents on the road for the Lions to face. A lot of other splits that I'm going to keep on analyzing and looking at as we get through this. Again, these are all going to go out. I'll have a full analysis of this going out to footballbetters.com, a free email newsletter for everyone to follow. More than 17,000 bettors already follow it. If you want to become one of them, head over to footballbetters.com. You can sign up for free, and these emails will be going out. I'll probably split it up into conferences or divisions and look at those as we go. So if you're interested in doing that, head over to footballbetters.com. Before I go, for anybody watching, over 186 of you on the live stream, let me know in the comments. What do you have? Any questions? You have anything I want to wrap up with? Any questions? Free agency, speculation, teams, anything from the win totals? Would love to know any questions you have before wrapping up, for anybody that has them. Do have a question here from Ken Clutch or Kluch. Could be saying it either way. Going a completely different direction. Shows the signs of the season that we are in as we're sitting here on March 6th. Any golf plays for this weekend? I've got none. And Ken, honestly, I've been posting a ton at bettingtalk.com about TGL. And things have been going pretty well over the course of the TGL season. I've been betting that. I thought the prices on a lot of the TGL stuff was way off. We're obviously at the end of that season with the playoffs coming up, just a couple of matches left. But I am absolutely watching what's going on at Bay Hill. I think the course conditions are fascinating today with the wind and how much guys are struggling. Makes for a very fun tournament. I always love when courses like this that are iconic play a lot more difficult than they typically do. I always find that a lot more to fun as a big golf fan and a big golf purist myself. So I'm rooting for wind. I'm rooting for tough conditions. I'm rooting for an exciting finish. Perhaps something later in the week comes up as taking someone in play to win the tournament. I'll keep an eye on that. And if there's anything mentioned in future live streams, I'll bring it up. But I appreciate the golf question. All right. That will do it for me today. Hope everybody has a fantastic Thursday. Enjoy the rest of your day. We'll maybe have another one of these tomorrow or into the weekend. But certainly there will be an email going out at footballbetters.com with analysis of the schedule and all the strengths of schedule numbers that I have found. Have a great Thursday, everybody. Chat to you again soon.